I remember distinctly several years ago, a non-believer talking to me about the way this person's Christian friends engaged him in evangelism. This person said, yeah, they invite me to come to their church all the time, but they've never invited me to their house. They've never taken me to lunch. They've never said, you want to grab coffee? It's just like, come to my religious event. And I thought, oh, this person is showing us that we're actually missing a step in that we haven't actually invited people to engage in our lives. We're inviting them to come to our event, and we're hoping that our pastor or our really gifted preacher up on the stage will do the evangelism for us. But actually, one of the most compelling ways we could bear witness is the invitation of strangers into our homes.
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. This is an experiential podcast where we not only want to help you learn about the way of Jesus, we want to help you practice the way of Jesus in your everyday life.
We're back for another episode of Practicing the Practices, where Casey and I are diving deep into the practice of evangelism. Now, going back to our previous episode, Casey, we ended with this teaser that's going to lead into our conversation today, that two things are absolutely essential when it comes to evangelism. One is that this is a non-negotiable practice, right? We don't get to be like, well, I'm not an evangelist, but there's a tendency for people to embrace scripture or prayer or Sabbath or church attendance to be like, those are totally Christian things to do, but then kind of, ease evangelism off the plate of things they want to do. And there's some reason for that. We discussed those. The other kind of closing concept we investigated was that one of the barriers to evangelism is that how we evangelize, how we bear witness, how we share the gospel has to change. Matter of fact, we used the word pivot. Like we needed to make some word pivots. And I thought you had some good insight into some of the reasons why. So maybe just share a little bit about why you think evangelism requires something a bit different from us than maybe some of the other practices.
Yeah, I was thinking as we were talking last time, isn't it interesting that if you and I were to practice fasting, it's going to pretty much look the same as it always has. Fasting as a practice is abstaining from something. And, the way we abstain from food is probably going to look pretty similar to how people 100 years from now will abstain from food, maybe, unless they're doing it on their spaceship or something. But, most of these practices that we engage in are pretty ancient and really don't change that much. Prayer, pretty similar. I don't know, what are some other, reading scripture, again, Sabbath. Now, we might not engage in them the way that we need to, but the practice itself is pretty similar. But when you think about evangelism, I caught myself thinking last time we were talking, wow, this practice really requires a lot of movement because our culture is constantly moving and changing, and the way communication in our culture happens is constantly shifting. And so I don't know why we think we should be evangelizing the people of this culture the way that evangelism was happening in the 50s, let's say, because it's just a completely different culture.
Yeah. And we can really go a bit deeper in that, and we will just for a moment, that here's what we're not saying. We're not saying that the gospel changes. Like the good news is the same good news for us as it was for the very first people who heard the message of Jesus. But the presentation of that good news evolves. And we actually see that in the New Testament. Matter of fact, the kind of ground zero for the church and the beginning of this new gospel kingdom proclamation was Jerusalem. And it was primarily Judaizers and Jewish people with a small handful of Gentiles, Greeks and so forth. By the way, by the time you get halfway through your New Testament, the gospel in the church has now multiplied into kind of areas of the Roman and Greek Empire, and you can see the way the original Christians evangelized shift. Paul, Peter, when they were evangelizing their Jewish brethren, like they spoke to that culture, they spoke to that language, they spoke to the traditions and practices and rhythms of that particular group of people. And then when Paul is taking Timothy out on missionary journeys and the church in Antioch is engaged in evangelism, like the way Paul is doing apologetics in the public square, the references to literature, it all shifts because the audience shifted. So he changed his presentation mode. So this is not something new. We're actually describing the ancient practice of becoming all things to all people, as the OG Paul said himself. So what we want to do today, Casey, is examine at least 3 pivots that we need to make for our cultural moment and our cultural place. Now, this is not necessarily the pivots that need to be made in South America or Asia or the Middle East, but in a modern, Western, kind of post-Christian, or even in some places of our own country, pre-Christian culture, here's some pivots we need to make. And by pivots, these are some of the adjustments in how we go about bearing witness, how we go about sharing the gospel. And so here are the 3 pivots. I'm going to name them, and then we'll just kind of talk about them briefly. So one of the things that we want to put on the table is that we make a shift from hostility to hospitality. So hospitality in place of hostility would be one pivot. We'll unpack that in a moment. Another pivot is that we want to become better at listening in the place of just making better arguments. And the third shift we'll talk about is this idea of living subversive lives in place of synchronized lives. So hospitality in place of hostility. What do I mean by hostility? Here's the thing. Hostility is sometimes what people experience with abrasive, in-your-face forms of evangelism. It's not that maybe, Casey, we are intending to be hostile, but it's just how people experience it. So one of the things that we're suggesting is a move towards an evangelism and a mission, a way of bearing witness that centers our witness in the context of hospitality. Now, we've done episodes on hospitality and where we referenced evangelism, but never really focused on it. So I think one of the things I would encourage our listeners to do, if you haven't listened to our conversations about hospitality, go back and visit those so you kind of have a good understanding of what we're thinking about. Because when we talk about hospitality, some people probably hear entertainment. But if you listen to those episodes, we'd say that's not what we mean by hospitality, right? One of the things that you brought out in our early episodes was that hospitality was this befriending of the stranger. That actually true hospitality is the welcome of the outsider, not just our closest of friends. So when you think about that like on the very, front edge, hospitality is very much a form of evangelism because you're inviting those who are on the outside in.
Yeah, and I think that is so crucial, especially in a culture like ours here in America that is so polarized, where people can kind of say whatever they want online, and us versus them in every sector of life, whether it's politics, just opinion, philosophy, religion, us versus them can just become kind of the norm, and we can kind of put thoughts and comments out there on social media without really having to face any ramifications from them. And so we don't really find a lot of places where we embrace the ethic of Jesus of welcoming the stranger. And really that's who God is. That's what Jesus did. He welcomed us in while we were strangers, while we were still against him. He welcomed us in. So I think part of evangelism is getting really honest with myself. Who am I not willing to welcome? Who am I not willing to engage with? And if I am coming at someone in a spirit of hostility, they are not going to hear what I have to say about Jesus.
So hospitality does at least 2 things with evangelism. The first thing that comes to mind, Casey, for me is it makes evangelism more personal. So there's kind of a broad street evangelism, stadium evangelism, even Sunday morning evangelism that's very impersonal. I'm just proclaiming a message to whoever might hear this message. Whereas if you're sitting at my table, I'm engaging you in your story, in your doubts, in your history. It becomes more personal. And then obviously, if you're at my table, it's much more incarnational. Which, how compelling is incarnational evangelism in a world where we're so detached because our lives are so digitized? I think it actually makes evangelism very incarnational and also, in one sense, very ancient. When I think about incarnational, hospitable evangelism, my mind is drawn to John chapter 4, which is this beautiful story of Jesus engaging the woman at the well. Jesus finds himself at a watering hole. He's tired, he's exhausted, and it's lunchtime. And he sends his disciples in to grab some lunch, and he engages this woman in a conversation in the most of ordinary of ways, right? Now, there's nothing ordinary about Jesus, but Jesus gets thirsty, we get thirsty. This woman comes to gather water for her, family, the people in her household. That is just it's a pretty normal, ordinary activity. And there Jesus engages with her, becomes curious. We'll talk a little bit about the questions, but it just was ordinary. I think about the way Jesus engaged the most polarizing people in his day. Jesus was sarcastically attacked as being someone who seemed to be a reviler because he seemed to be a partier. His reputation was that he would have dinner and, almost be seen as someone hanging out at a party with tax collectors and sinners. And there's something powerful about this, and it draws me to a conversation I had, and I want to give you a chance to respond to this. I remember distinctly several years ago a non-believer talking to me about the way this person's Christian friends engaged him in evangelism. And I don't think I'll ever forget this. This person said, yeah, they invite me to come to their church all the time, but they've never invited me to their house. They've never taken me to lunch. They've never said, you want to grab coffee? It's just like, come to my religious event. And I thought, oh, this person is showing us that we're actually missing a step in that we haven't actually invited people to engage in our lives. We're inviting them to come to our event, and we're hoping that our pastor or our really gifted preacher up on the stage will do the evangelism for us. When actually one of the most compelling ways we could bear witness is the invitation of strangers into our homes.
Yeah, that's so good. I was just thinking, I was having a conversation with my husband about this subject a little bit ago, and he was talking about the same idea. It's not come to our thing our event we're hosting, but come share life with us, come be with us. And I was also thinking about hostility and why is it that, there's been this tendency in Christianity to get really hostile. I think that what's happening when we find ourselves having a really hostile reaction, a really big reaction to something somebody posted on Facebook or some opinion that they have that's anti the way of Jesus, we find ourselves getting hostile. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of the time it's because of fear.
Yeah.
Either because of fear that we're not going to be able to convince them what's right, or fear that we're maybe a little insecure in what we believe in that setting or in that issue, or we don't know how to defend it or why. But I think, honestly, we need to be able to be honest with ourselves and go, why am I so hostile? Like, why does it bother me if you believe in something I don't believe? If I feel secure and no fear in what I believe in my relationship with God, I don't need to be afraid. And then when we're not afraid and we can just let you be on your journey with God, and we don't, that Jesus never told people that they were right or that their beliefs were true when he didn't think so, but he didn't feel the need to be so defensive because he was so secure in who he was. Jesus was the most secure human. And I think we're feeling fearful or insecure when we feel the need to get so loud and so hostile.
Well, there certainly seems to be, Casey, a sense in which the culture warrior mentality that's oftentimes attached to Christianity has influenced how we think about evangelism. That it's all of a sudden, it's not so much that I want you to know the good news about Jesus, but I need to win your way of living to our ethic.
Right.
And Paul even once said in the New Testament with this whole concept of, here's how the pagans are living. And then he's like, hey, let's get our house in order. Well, what business is it of mine how these people who aren't following the way are living? And his point was, Jesus has to bring their hearts to life. Like that's where our focus should start. Now, that doesn't mean we don't contend for what is good and just and right, but the kind of the bleeding of this hostile, hey, I need to convert you to my way of being is not evangelism. And, there's a great book that both of us like when it comes to this idea of hospitality. It's, the gospel comes with a house key. And Rosaria Butterfield says this, is that our post-Christian neighbors need to hear and see and taste and feel authentic Christianity, hospitality spreading from every Christian home that includes neighbors in prayer, food, friendship, childcare, dog walking, and all the daily matters upon which friendships are built. Casey, I have some diverse friendships and some people who believe wildly different than me about a lot of things, from politics to human sexuality to whatever. And when we are engaged in dinner around my table, like the way we engage each other, the level of respect and openness looks way different than what we see on the internet. And I don't know that we're going to win the world by making our point louder. Our best hope of winning the world is by actually getting to know the people who have a different perspective than us. And the only way you can do that is by sharing your life with them. Any other thoughts on hospitality over hostility as our first pivot?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking how we can only really live in this kind of fearless way where I'm okay with being with you and you have a different perspective than me if we remember that only the Spirit of God can change a human heart.
That's good.
That is not my job. My job is to show up and love you, to tell you the truth if you ask me. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I agree with you if I don't. I can be bold and courageous in sharing what I believe, and also loving of you with where you are, because it is not on me to change your heart.
Yeah.
That is a work of the Spirit that I can certainly participate in as invited by the Spirit, but that's not on me. So I don't need to be afraid about not succeeding at that.
Yeah, that's so good. The second pivot we want to consider, which I think is directly linked to hospitality, is this idea that the way we bear witness, that what we would lead with is listening. In other words, we want to be better at listening in the place of having the best arguments. For several years, it seems like the way Christians want to engage in the public space was like, hey, let's see who can bring the best argument, who can tear down all of the false ideas. Matter of fact, it's really popular to see, on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, all of these public debates. That became really popular for a long time. Like, let's get the best Christian apologist.
Yeah, apologetics.
And the atheist and let them go to town. And more and more, there's a whole new generation that's not actually compelling to them at all. That there actually probably needs to be a shift in how we go about arguments. I'm not saying that we shouldn't know what we believe, that we shouldn't be ready to give an answer, but there is a shift where we're saying, hey, let's move from how quickly can I tell this person all of the brilliant things that I know and make all the brilliant arguments I have for Christianity to what would it look like for me to be curious about your story, about your pain points, about where you're pursuing pleasure, about your problematic experiences, and then allow that to shape what our evangelism looks like versus, hey, let me just win the day with my arguments. More curiosity, less assumptions.
And we see this first and foremost in the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus was a master question asker. And if we really read the gospel looking through that lens of the questions Jesus asked, the way he engaged people, often he just had the most brilliant question. Even when the Pharisees were trying to trip him up, he would always kind of ask them a question that would kind of turn it back on them.
Yeah.
And it's such a simple and profound way to handle conversations with people that come at us. Well, why do you believe this is wrong as a Christian? Well, why do you believe it's right? I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah.
And it really is disarming to people because they're used to, I think, or the public conception is that we're going to come at them with, like you said, all these arguments that they're going to have to tear down. When you ask someone a really pointed question and are curious, I think it can be really disarming to them.
So in the late 90s, early 2000s, new atheism had really taken kind of a stronghold in the public sphere. Christopher Hitchens. I was thinking Charles Dickens, but it's Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, kind of that ilk. They were such good rhetoricians. Whether they had good arguments or not was irrelevant. They were so skilled in their rhetoric, and it became really kind of popular on college campuses. Like I just remember all of this, angst over, the way we were moving towards atheism. Well, it's interesting. We have now lived long enough. I've lived long enough to see a whole generation consume that and actually decide, nihilism isn't the way. And new atheism is kind of out of vogue now. And there is a new generation that's actually less angsty about whether or not God exists. They actually are longing for some sort of spiritual experience. That really needs to shape how we think about our evangelism. I think that really is one of the reasons why this whole idea of listening is so important. Because oftentimes when I've engaged people in what I would call witness or evangelism conversations, turns out, Casey, it's not so much that the people, it's not that their main questions are about the historicity of the New Testament or the reliability of the resurrection. Matter of fact, some of their angst over the ethics is like, they're just really wounded and hurt here. And that's the thing that's really in the way. Or they're just really wanting to chase pleasure. They just want to sleep with their boyfriend or girlfriend and live their life their own way. They want to be their own God. But the only way for me to get there and then to really kind of wrestle with that with them is to be curious and to do exactly what you said, like to ask questions, to be willing to engage with people in the long haul. I listened to this lady. Her name escapes me, but she's the founder of the Jude 3 Project, which is this really cool apologetic ministry. The Jude 3 Project is inspired by the Jude, which only has one chapter, verse 3, earnestly contend for the faith, and they mostly engage in African-American spaces. And like a lot of the arguments they might, encounter is Christianity just a white man's religion and so forth. But she's describing her own journey. And when she was in seminary, she describes like having this very visceral reaction against God or being frustrated with God, questioning God, because there was a terrorist event where children were killed. And she goes to her New Testament professor, who's such a winsome teacher and seems to have all the answers. And she says, how can God be good and this terrorists kill all these children? I just have such a big problem with that. This creates so many questions in my mind. And so she's presenting this to this New Testament scholar in her seminary and is kind of assuming now he's going to come back and break down all the answers. And he just responded and said, yeah, me too. Mm-hmm. And that kind of sent her on the trajectory of what eventually said, what if we could just kind of lean into that tension with people? Yeah, tell me more about that. What else would you say about why curiosity and listening is such an important pivot versus just making the best arguments?
Well, I think one thing is that not all of us, we made the point, all of us are called to evangelism. Sure. Not all of us have maybe the intellectual prowess to know all of the best arguments, right? Some people are really gifted in that way. Some people, that's really challenging. Some people get really nervous and tripped up and, they might know the answers, but having those kind of conflict-oriented conversations are really hard. But honestly, all of us can ask questions. Like anybody
Yes.
can do this. This really takes it down to like human to human level. We don't have to be able to, I think, like you said, we should know what we believe, but not all of us are going to be skilled to go have some major religious debate with somebody else. Like that's not for everyone, but we can all ask questions. We can all learn the skill of asking better questions. And we can all say, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
It's simple. Anyone can do it. So if we're all called to evangelism, then this is a skill we all need to learn how to ask better questions.
These testimonies exist, but I'm going to say that 99,000 times out of 100,000 times, if you're a Christian, if you're a believer, your story is not, I was sitting in my sophomore philosophy class and I got engaged and this person just, man, they explained everything and I became a follower of Jesus. Now, it's not that the engaging that isn't important, but most of our stories is this person loved me so well, or I went through this tragedy and I experienced Jesus in those moments. So how can we show up and be curious, in people's problems and their challenges and really try to get to the root issue of what's keeping them from finding hope in Jesus? Maybe you end up finding someone in your workspace, or maybe if you're a college student and they just are super angry because they've seen Christians behaving badly. Like for you not to excuse it, but just be like, I know, that really bothers me. I'm so sorry. And then not having to counter that with like, but have you encountered the reliability of the transmission of the New Testament text? Have you compared that with how many editions of Tacitus's history? No, it's how do we become better listeners, not just have better arguments. And that leads us to the third pivot. And it's this Jesus originating idea of living subversive lives in place of synchronized lives. Here's what we mean by that. Is if we live in sync with the culture, if we share the same values with the culture, if our daily rhythms look exactly like the culture, if the way we consume products and do transactions looks exactly like the culture, all of a sudden our gospel just seems like some sort of random abstract ideology we've chosen to embrace. One of the things that made the gospel so compelling in the days of the New Testament, the early days of the Roman Empire, and if you trace through human history, revivals where like people began to turn to Jesus in like significant numbers of people, the Christians, the followers of the way, lived very subversive lives that were very compelling to the culture. So one example comes to mind. Here's an exchange, Casey, that I had some time ago with a guest at our church. And I'm sure they meant well, and this is not in any way intended to be an attack on this mindset, but we live here in East Tennessee. This is known as the Bible Belt. And a couple moved here from a part of the country that's very less Bible Beltish. And they described, when I said, hey, what brought you here to East Tennessee? The way they described it was they were trying to leave this place that was just dark and evil and go to a place that didn't have as much darkness and evil. And they had categories of sin where they moved from that to them, this was like the really bad evil. And now we're in the Bible Belt where it's not as bad. And I think I really probably offended them. And I said, oh, you're new here. I'm a lifelonger here. I just need you to know there's a lot of evil here. And man, we have got a big mammon problem. I could just see kind of their facial expression go from it was just kind of like a disappointing response. And it was just spontaneous, but I've thought about that a lot recently. And Casey, you don't have middle school sons like I do. You've got a high school age son. So maybe you've heard of this before. But if you've got like a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade boy, the Beast Games are a big deal on YouTube. Have you heard of the Beast Games?
I have not.
So imagine the Squid Games without the violence and the cursing and the sex. The Beast Games are these competitions to win like crazy amounts of money. Like the most recent competitions, like for $5 million. And there's like Lamborghinis. And there's a sense in which a lot of people are saying, man, this is so great. This is so much more wholesome. And it's true that there's not crude language. It's true that there's not a lot of sexuality, but it is a intense demonstration of what Jesus would call as mammon. And like Jesus is so harsh on the love of money and material wealth that it seems like maybe in Christian circles, when we think about living different lives, we almost only think about, we shouldn't be, we should be sexually pure. We shouldn't embezzle money and these kind of big things. But actually it's like not being given to mammon, like how you spend your time, how you interact with the world. This, the Sermon on the Mount, the way Jesus described the Christian life there, taking root in our lives, like that's what we mean when we talk about living subversive lives and not synchronized lives.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Dallas Willard said, which was this: the world's wisdom emphasizes control and dominance, but the way of Christ is the way of relinquishment, service, and radical trust in God's sufficiency. We do not escape the world, but we engage it differently through love, humility, and the pursuit of God's kingdom. So if we are not engaging the world in a way that is different, and we're not really living out these things that we're willing to fight for in a verbal way with other people, but if they're not really soaking into our lives, then I don't know, what are we doing?
Something that comes to mind, Casey, is how we, as followers of Jesus, engage the hard stuff in our life. It's not that we engage the hard stuff and act like it's not hard. It's not that we don't grieve. It's not that when we feel like something's going against us that shouldn't be going against us, that it doesn't bother us. But what if it didn't crush us? What if our identity was not in our job? And so the idea of stomping on top of everybody else to get to the top just wasn't part of our ethic. What if when you and everyone else maybe in your department were kind of tempted to compromise ethically, that you just if I lose my job, I'll lose my job. But I'm going to be honorable. I'm going to be ethical. Those are some of the subversive ways. If you're a middle schooler or a college student, what would it look like for you to just your identity not to be rooted in all of these different things, but to really put your hope in Jesus? That creates a compelling way of living that makes people ask the questions we referenced in our first episode. Why do you do that? Or why do you not do that? How do you do that? What is that all about? When you think about a subversive way of living, maybe the most subversive way we could live is to practice Sabbath and those sorts of rhythms, right? It throws people off. Every now and then people will say to me, Brad, I know you're so busy. And I'll just say, I'm not busy. And they're like, I'm like, no. What do you mean? And it's almost jarring. What if we just really took seriously what it meant to follow the way of Jesus? I love the C.S. Lewis quote that you dug up, Casey. If you read history, you'll find that the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. There is this great quote that has survived antiquity from a man known as Julian the Apostate. And he is the emperor after Constantine. And Edict of Milan, religious freedom, all of a sudden, persecution is not as viable. But there are some who are just frustrated that the Roman Empire is moving towards the way of Jesus, which they literally fought against for 300 years. And Julian wants to return it back to its pagan roots, but he's having no luck at it. And he writes a letter to a colleague, and he complains that there is no way to move the momentum because Christians, quote, are not only taking care of their own who were sick with the plagues and so forth, but they're taking care of ours. And everyone can see that our own people lack aid from us. And the reason is when if you were living in Rome when the plagues came and you had money, you got out of Dodge. But all of these Christians would stay behind and care for the sick. And the testimony became, it's because they don't believe this is the only life that there is, that there's another life. It gave them a courage to live subversively instead of to live the way the Romans and Greeks did.
That's a beautiful story. And I think as we close up today, it would just be really good for us, as we always like to take a moment to practice and pause, to just take a moment and consider, where am I most needing a pivot in my life, in the way I engage with people that don't believe the same way I do? Am I needing to embrace more hospitality in place of hostility? Do I need to practice on my listening skills and my question asking skills instead of just trying to find the best argument? Or do I really need to kind of take stock of how I'm living my life, how I'm spending my money, my time, what I value, and what that says about me? And are my beliefs really matching the way that I'm actually living? So just take a moment for the next few minutes and ask the Lord, where would you be inviting me to pivot in my practice of evangelism?
Thank you, Casey. And thanks for joining us for another episode of Practicing the Practices. Leave us a review if you don't mind. It helps more people engage with the podcast. Like and share it. And don't miss our next episode, where we interview a good friend of mine, Tim Hood, on what it means to be a missionary. We're going to ask a career missionary of what it looks like for us to live a life of witness and evangelism in our ordinary, normal day lives. Till then, for Ethan and for Casey, this is Brad. Grace and peace.